Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Let me begin by thanking the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy for inviting me to this event. I have enjoyed every piece of it since I arrived and since I started attending the sessions in the morning. Now, since it's getting late, I'm going to do something that I usually don't do when I make presentations, which is give the message of the presentation before I actually make it. We've had a long day, and I'm sure most of you are getting a bit tired. So I'm just going to start with the messages of this presentation. Now, there are three key messages I would like us to leave this room with. The first is that China-Africa cooperation should be welcomed and strengthened. It has a positive impact on Africa's economic development. And the second message is that African countries have to be proactive in their partnership or economic cooperation with China. And this is important because if they want to derive any significant benefits from the process, or basically address their development needs through the relationships, they have to be more proactive. In other words, they have to have a well-defined strategy of what they want to get out. For what they want to get out of their relationships with China. So far, China has been driving the process, but it's important that African countries also have their own strategy, and in particular, integrate it into their national development plans. And then the final message, which I think is the most important message of this presentation, is that China-Africa cooperation has to be geared more towards the development of productive capacities. And what do I mean by that? It has to be geared towards promotion of capital accumulation, technological progress, and structural transformation. And these three components will ensure that Africa can use China-Africa cooperation to diversify its economies and thereby lay the foundation for strong and sustained economic growth. So those are the three key messages. Whatever I say today would be geared towards these three messages. Okay. Now, this is the structure of the presentation. I'm going to start off with some background information on Africa-South cooperation, because we have to situate this within that context. That's how it makes sense. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the patterns of cooperation that we've seen between Africa and non-African developing countries. And that will take me into a discussion of some of the main trends and dimensions of China-Africa cooperation. In particular, I will emphasize three vectors. One is trade, the second is foreign direct investment, and finally, aid or official flows. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how China-Africa cooperation has led to some positive developments in Africa. And that will take me into a discussion of some issues that has arisen as a result of Africa's growing engagement with China. I mean, some people talk about the impact on environmental quality, some talk about the impact on debt sustainability, and some talk about the impact on governance. These are some of the burning issues that have arisen as a result of these relationships. So I'm going to try to address some of those. And then that will take me to the most important aspect of the presentation, which is basically how can we manage this process such that it results in a win-win cooperation. So it's not just beneficial to China, but also to Africa. And then I'll make some concluding remarks. So that's where we're headed. Okay, let me begin by saying that in the last at least 10 years, or I mean specifically since the beginning of the new millennium, we've noticed a significant increase in the importance of developing countries, particularly the large ones like China, India, Brazil. We've witnessed a significant increase in their role in the global economy. And you can see this in four key areas. One is in terms of trade. The second is in terms of foreign direct investment. The third is in terms of aid. And finally, global governance. Now, in the area of trade, the share of developing countries in global trade increased from about 25% in 1985 to 39% in 2008. So that's a big increase, in the share of developing countries in world trade. Now, in terms of foreign direct investment, it increased from about 14% in 1980 to 37% in 2008. So that's also a very big leap. These developing countries are also playing important role in terms of aid. It's more difficult to give a precise figure for what their contribution is to aid, because in most cases they don't disclose this. So it's difficult to give a precise number. But there are indications that they are playing important roles in terms of contributions to aid flows to Africa. And then finally, they're becoming important players in global economic governance. As most of you must have observed, the G8 is no longer the key venue for discussion of global economic issues. It's now G20. And part of the reason is that they've realized that developing countries are becoming very important in the global economy. So you cannot discuss global economic issues without bringing China, India, Brazil, South Africa, and other emerging economies. So basically, we've seen an increase in the role of developing countries in the global economy. And that has led to a resurgence of interest in South-South cooperation. It has also created a lot of opportunities for economic cooperation between Africa and non-African developing countries. And we've seen this in terms of the number of new initiatives on Africa-South cooperation. What I'm going to do now is show you a sort of picture that we came up with, which gives a sort of framework for discussion of these types of relationships that African countries have entered into with other Southern countries. It's not comprehensive, but it captures, most of the key relationships. Okay, I don't know if you can see. Can you see? Can you see it? Okay. It's a bit faint, but I hope you can read it. Okay, so basically, Africa's relationship with non-African developing countries, you can put that into 3 categories. The first is bilateral. That's between an African country and a non-African developing country, just 2 countries. Now, within that framework, you have those that have formal dialogue platforms. That is, they have some sort of framework, like in the case of China, it's called a Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. It's a platform that is set up to enable the 2 countries or regions discuss their economic cooperation issues. It also enables them to monitor the degree of implementation of what they have promised to each other. So that's a bilateral relationship with a formal dialogue platform. So an example is China's relationship with Africa. India also has one. Turkey has one. And Korea also has one. Now, we have other types of bilateral relationships between Africa and non-African developing countries that do not have bilateral dialogue platforms. For example, the relationship with Brazil. Brazil is heavily involved in Africa, but it doesn't have any formal dialogue platform. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Malaysia, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. So that's one cluster, the bilateral relationships. And the second type of relationship is what we call the trilateral relationship. So this is basically a relationship between an African country and 2 developing countries in different regions of the world. And the most interesting case is called IPSA, which is the India-Brazil-South Africa relationship. It was set up in 2003, basically to increase the influence of these 3 countries in the global arena. And then finally, we have the interregional relationships. So they're basically between regions, Africa, Asia, Africa, South America, Africa, Arab countries, and so on and so forth. So that's basically the framework we set up to analyze some of these relationships, which we found interesting. Now, so what are some of the interesting features of these relationships? Because people talk a lot about China, Africa, Brazil, Africa. What are the interesting features? What makes these relationships interesting relative to what we've seen in the relationship between Western nations and African countries? Well, in terms of the aim, the official explanation you get from most of these governments is that their aim is to promote Africa-South cooperation for reciprocal benefits. They are based on some unique principles, the most important being non-interference. They don't interfere in the internal affairs of each other. So this is distinct from Africa's relationship with Western nations, where sometimes you have issues of policy conditionalities. So non-interference is a key feature of these relationships. Now, in terms of the modes of interaction, I've already talked about the fact that some of them have formal dialogue platforms, like forums, summits, and so on and so forth. And they tend to cover political, economic, social and cultural cooperation. What I found interesting is the accountability mechanism. Now, in a number of them, like the relationship with China, Korea, India, and Turkey, they have monitoring mechanisms which basically tells them whether they are implementing some of the commitments that they have made in the relationships. And then finally, even though the relationships are mostly signed by or implemented by governments, there are attempts to increase the role of the private sector in the process. Okay. Now, a lot of people say, well, China is coming to Africa to help Africa. Some say, no, they're not coming to help Africa. They must be coming to look for something that is of interest to them. Now, both sides are correct. So what this is showing is basically the key strategic interests of some of these large developing countries who come to Africa. Well, they want to help Africa, but that's just one reason why they are in Africa. They also have their own personal or individual interests. Now, we've clustered them into three categories. Some are looking for market access. They want to sell their products in Africa. Some are looking for Africa's support on global issues, for example, UN reform and so on and so forth. Some see Africa as a source of resources. They're looking for oil, they're looking for cobalt, they're looking for copper, all sorts of things. Now, of course, depending on the country that you're talking about, it may be more interested in one of the three areas we've identified here. In the case of Brazil, China, and India, they seem to be interested in the three clusters. But Turkey is more interested in market access. That's where we see it making a lot of inroads into Africa. And then Korea seems to be more interested in natural resources. So this is in addition to their desire to help Africa. They have their own personal interests or strategic interests. So the challenge here is, how can they strike a balance between these strategic interests and the development needs of Africa? And that's where we think the action should be. Okay, so now let me focus on China-Africa, which is the topic of this presentation. Now, clearly, China is a big country, and in terms of relationships with Africa, it is the most significant, in terms of country coverage. It's involved in pretty much all African countries except 4 countries that have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, for example, Burkina Faso, the Gambia, and some other countries. Also in terms of scale, that's the amount that it invests in Africa. It's also the largest of all the developing countries that are entering into relationships with Africa. And as I said earlier, the relationships cover 3 areas: trade, foreign direct investment, and aid. So now I'm going to talk about the first vector, which is trade. Now, what I want you to get out of this table is the fact that since 2000, China's trade with Africa has increased at a very rapid rate. Relative to, it's growing faster than intra-African trade, which is trade within Africa as a continent. It is growing faster than Africa's trade with all developing countries. And it is growing faster than Africa's trade with developed countries. And it is growing faster than Africa's total trade. You can see that between 2000 and 2008, it grew at about 1,044%. So it rose from 8 billion to 92 billion within a very short period. So this is why we should take it seriously. If it continues growing at this rate, at some point China is going to be the main actor in Africa. In fact, this year, in 2009, not this year, sorry, last year, in 2009, China became the largest trade partner of Africa. It used to be the United States, and then European countries before China. Now China is the largest trading partner for Africa. So it's a major development. Now, in terms of foreign direct investment, there has also been an increase, but not as much as in the area of trade. Trade is the key vector. But they're also making inroads in terms of investing in Africa. In 2003, they invested 75 million in Africa. In 2008, it was 5.5 billion. For 2009, it's around 7 billion. So it's growing. Not as fast as trade, but it's still growing. Now, in terms of aid, as I said earlier, one problem with China's relationship with Africa is that there is lack of information on what it does on the continent. China doesn't publish its aid figures. Sometimes they give you, bits here and there, but you cannot get a comprehensive picture of their aid activities on the continent. And that has made it very difficult to compare their development assistance to Africa to those of OECD countries, which is something that is interesting to do, to know where the areas of differences arise. Now, what we do know is that China has been giving a lot of concessional loans to Africa. In particular, in the last 3 years, they gave about 5 billion. So these loans, they come with various rates of interest. Now, normally, if a country gives aid to another country, and because that aid is from the official sector, and its objective is economic development, and it has a grant element of at least 25%, then you call it aid. Now, if a country gives concessional loans, it has a grant element, but you don't know the percentage of the grant element. You can't call it aid. Because to call it aid, based on the OECD definition, it has to have a grant element of at least 25%. So the problem is sometimes when you read in the papers, you hear China has given aid to Africa of 7 billion. Some say 20 billion. Some say 5 billion. Some say 1 billion. It's hard to know what the exact figure is because the only way you can tell is if you know the terms, the exact terms of the loan. So it's hard to compare these figures to the OECD figures. Now, if an OECD country gives loan to Africa, we know what to call it because it meets the various criteria used to define aid. In the case of China, it's very difficult. Okay, so that's why sometimes when you read the papers, you see different numbers. One paper will tell you it's 1 billion, another will say it's 20. So it's because we're adding apples and oranges. They're not quite things that are comparable. Okay, now one very important feature of China's aid to Africa is that it is heavily concentrated in the infrastructure sector. Most of their financing goes to infrastructure. In fact, about 54% of it goes to infrastructure. Now, is this good or bad? Well, I think it's good because to the extent that it is good for developing productive capacity, it is a good thing. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the impact of China-Africa cooperation because China may be doing a lot in Africa, but if it doesn't have a positive impact on growth in Africa, then it's meaningless. It's not that China is replacing OECD countries that should make African countries suddenly think that it's a good thing. It depends on what they're doing. And in particular, we don't want people to see these relationships as being some sort of a substitute for Africa's relations with OECD countries. We want them to look at these relationships as complementary because the development challenges facing Africa, they're so enormous that OECD countries alone can't solve them. So the more money you can get on the continent to address some of these growing development challenges, the better. So it's better to see these relationships as complementary rather than, as in competition. Now, having said that, based on the work that we have done, we believe that so far China's engagement in Africa has had some positive impact. And you can see it in a number of ways. It has led to an increase in the volume of exports coming from Africa. There's been a huge demand for commodities as a result of the enormous growth that we see in China. So that has led to an increase in export volumes in Africa. It has also led to an increase in Africa's purchasing power in the sense that it has increased Africa's terms of trade. Now, in the past, one of the problems African countries had was that they export primary products, they import manufacturers. So and we know that the price of primary products, they tend to decline over time. So because of that, their terms of trade has gone down appreciably over a very long period of time. So that leads to a loss of purchasing power. So you're exporting, you may be exporting more, but the price of that the price that you're receiving for those exports is going down, which means your purchasing power is going down. So you need to export more to import a given unit of good. So one good development that is coming out of Africa's relationship with China is that it has led to an improvement in Africa's terms of trade. So there is some increase in purchasing power. And then China has also made significant contributions to infrastructure. And as I said earlier, to the extent that infrastructure helps in developing productive capacity, that should be seen as a good thing to make a positive contribution to growth. Now, another area where China's relationship with Africa has had a positive impact is in terms of giving Africa some policy space. You see, in Africa's relationship with OECD countries, I mean, OECD countries, they've done a lot in Africa, but they still have a lot of problems with that, an image problem in Africa, because they tend to give these assistance with policy conditions. So we give you a given amount, and we tell you, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. So because of that, African countries lost some sort of ownership of the aid process. They lost some policy space, the ability to, design and use policies they deem necessary for their economic development. That space they lost. Now China is giving it back to them. And that's why sometimes people wonder, why are African countries so excited about China? It is because they see China. China is, okay, let me put it this way. China sees them as partners, business partners. OECD countries see them as aid recipients. There's a big difference in this approach. So you may be giving a country a lot of money, but if you treat the country as an aid recipient, that country will always be in people's mindset when they look at these relationships. So what China has succeeded in doing is make African countries feel that they are real partners with China. And as such, they are equals, in a sense. So it has widened Africa's policy space, as I said. Now, another thing that it has done is that it has diversified Africa's export markets. In the past, most of our exports went to OECD countries. And that made Africa very vulnerable to developments in OECD countries. So if OECD countries are growing rapidly, African countries are doing well. If they are declining, African countries are declining. Now, what China has done, and India and Brazil, is that now they have diversified Africa's exports. So to the extent that the economic cycles in OECD countries don't follow those of, say, China, India, and Brazil, this has led to some sort of diversification, and it has cushioned the impact of external shocks on African countries. And then it has also led to a decline in the prices of consumer goods in Africa, because now African countries import a lot of consumer goods from China, and most of these goods tend to have lower prices relative to goods you import from Europe. So to the extent that they have lower prices, it's good for consumers. But again, that has a negative side to it, which is that African producers find the competition from China very intense. They cannot produce goods at a price that is as low as what the Chinese producers can offer on the world market. So what that has done is that we've seen a decline in manufacturing production, light manufacturing in particular, like textiles and garments and things like that, which is the negative side to this relationship. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that African countries are facing, because it's not all rosy. Yes, there are good sides to it, but there are also bad sides, just like in any relationship. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. So in the case of Africa, China, there are so many challenges also. And one of them, which is something that is really worrying African leaders, is that you see, people thought that with China, India, and Brazil being more involved in Africa, that would change the pattern of trade, Africa's trade structure, basically. Because right now, Africa tends to export primary commodities to OECD countries and import manufactured goods. And we know that primary commodities, that's not the engine of growth in the world economy, it's manufactured goods. Most of the major innovations you see in the world economy, they come from manufactured goods. And most of the opportunities for export global export market expansion. They come from manufactured goods. If you look at all the successful countries in this world, they have one thing in common: production of manufactured goods. And that's where Africa is lacking. So to the extent that Africa-South cooperation enables African countries to increase exports of manufactured goods, that would have been seen as a good thing. Unfortunately, that's not what is happening. What we see is that Africa's relationship with China is actually reinforcing the pattern of trade that Africa has with OECD countries, which is that Africa exports primary commodities and imports manufactured goods. So this is a major challenge. And that's what these numbers are saying. I'm not going to go through them, but the PowerPoint is available. If you want, we can make copies for you. Now, the second challenge we see is that even though, well, first of all, let me talk about the trade balance, just in case there's somebody who doesn't understand the concept. A trade balance is basically the difference between what you export and what you import. Now, if you export, you get foreign exchange. That allows you to buy goods on the world market, which is imports. So if you're exporting more than you're importing, you get some surplus in terms of foreign exchange. If you're importing more than you export, you have a deficit. You have a problem. That deficit has to be financed, either by borrowing or running down your foreign reserves. Okay? So that's the sense in which we see. If you have a deficit in a year, it's not a problem. But if you keep having a trade deficit with a country over several years, that is not sustainable. That's the problem the United States has with China right now. All this talk about currency wars and between U.S. and China is over the trade deficit. The U.S. is concerned that it has had a trade deficit with China for several years, and obviously that's not sustainable. So they're trying to find a way to get China to appreciate its currency so that U.S. goods can move more freely into China, and that will help increase the trade position of the United States. Now, what we see in the case of China and Africa is that even though, for example, in 2008, Africa as a region had a trade surplus with China. You can see it was about 4.2 billion. Not much, but at least it was a surplus. However, it was only a few countries that had this huge surplus, a few oil exporters. In particular, about 41 countries had a trade deficit with China. So even though, if you look at the aggregate figure, Africa in 2008 had a trade surplus with China. 41 countries in the same year had a trade deficit with China. Okay. Now, another concern that people have with Africa's relationship with China is that it tends to be heavily concentrated in a few countries. If you look at the figure for 2008, we had 5 countries: Angola, Sudan, South Africa, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, accounting for 84% of Africa's exports to China. We had 3 countries: South Africa, Zambia, Nigeria, accounting for 94% of China's investment into Africa. Just 3 countries. And we had 4 countries: Nigeria, Angola, Ethiopia, Sudan, accounting for 72% of China's investment in infrastructure. So you can see, even though people talk about China being heavily involved in Africa, their involvement is skewed towards a few countries. And most of these countries are oil exporters. Not all, but most are oil exporters. So this is what is driving the criticism that China is more interested in natural resources as opposed to being an agent of real development in Africa. Now, another concern that people have has to do with whether China's involvement in Africa is leading to poor governance in Africa. Now, there are several debates here, but I think maybe what I should do is leave this issue. Maybe during question time, if somebody raises the issue, I will go into it. I mean, the basic idea in terms of governance is that normally OECD countries, when they give aid to a country, they impose some policy conditions. They tell you that you cannot run budget deficit, you have to privatize some companies, you have to take away subsidies, you have to liberalize your economy, and so on and so forth. And they also insist that, corruption, the government has to make an effort to reduce corruption. Now, the argument that you hear from OECD countries is that Now that China is making these loans easily available to African countries without conditions, that the governments don't have any incentive to impose or implement governance reforms that will help the country to grow. Now, there are two sides to this story. It's not clear that that there is any strong, convincing empirical evidence to show that this is indeed the case. The jury is still out on this. You may find instances where aid from China and India and Brazil may be encouraging governments to adopt corrupt practices. I don't want to mention countries, but there are a few countries like that. But there are also instances where aid from these countries have also helped to make governance even better. So it's not an issue that has conclusive empirical evidence. Now, one area where we have very, very serious concern with China's relationship with Africa is that, yes, they're investing in Africa, but in most cases, they tend to invest in such a way that there is very little linkage between that investment and the domestic economy. And you see it in a number of ways. One, when they invest in Africa, they impose not policy conditions, but non-policy conditions. For example, they may tell you that, well, I'm going to give you $9 billion to invest in, say, road construction. But you have to use Chinese labor. So that's not a policy condition. It's a non-policy condition. And it's a non-policy condition that makes it very difficult to establish positive linkages between that external investment and the domestic economy. Because if you hire, say, Chinese labor to work in, say, Kenya, that investment is not creating employment for Kenyans. And if it doesn't create employment for Kenyans, it's not going to increase output. It's not going to bring the sort of positive spillover effects that you expect from foreign direct investment. So that's one challenge that African countries face. They also tend to invest in natural resources. And we know that natural resources sector tends to be highly capital intensive. So the opportunities for employment generation tend to be much lower. And then the third aspect to it has to do with the fact that the Chinese, they're very good at constructing new roads, buildings, and so on and so forth, but not good in terms of teaching African countries on how to maintain them. So they can set up a rail network. It may function for 5, 10 years, and then the wagons break down, and that's it. So what do you do after that? So yes, they've helped, but they need to help the economy or the country to develop local capacity to maintain these infrastructure projects. Otherwise, it's just a one-off gain. If you want it to be a gain that is sustained over a long period of time, you have to teach the locals how to maintain these projects. And that's one of the issues we believe that China and African countries should discuss if they want to make this cooperation a win-win cooperation. And then I've talked about the fact that China doesn't give information on certain things that it does in Africa. And that makes it difficult to know the net impact of the activities in Africa. Okay, so now let me talk about what China needs to do, and also African countries need to do to ensure that this cooperation is a win-win cooperation. Now, on the African side, there are several things that they could do. First is that, as I said earlier, African countries, they have to, see, China has a strategy. China knows why it's in Africa. It has a long-term vision of what it wants to gain from Africa. It has a well-defined strategy. On the other hand, Africa doesn't have a well-defined strategy for engaging China in this process. I mean, they have a lot of wish lists. Oh, I want China to build an airport. I want China to develop a road here. I want China to invest in infrastructure, agriculture, and so on. But there's a difference between a wish list and a strategy. The fact that you want China to do something for you doesn't mean you have a strategy. It just means you have a wish. So you have to develop a strategy which is linked to your national development objectives. So you start with an objective. I want to do this. And then see how China can fit into that objective. And now, if that involves building a railroad, so be it. If that involves investing in agriculture, great. But you don't start with the investment. you want it to invest here and there. And that's what the African governments are doing. So if they want to really derive positive benefits from the process, they have to start by having a well-defined national and as well as regional strategy. And they have to ensure that their national strategies are consistent with the regional development objectives. Because when you look at what China does in Africa, even though it has dialogue platforms at the regional level, most of what it does is at the country level. And this does not have any clear link to Africa's regional development objectives. So one thing African countries could do is ensure that even when they have a national strategy with China, it has to be consistent with Africa's regional development objectives. Now, that would ensure that there is no conflict between African countries or competition between African countries for resources from China. Okay? Now, another thing African countries need to do is that they have to strengthen efforts to develop productive capacities. And they can do this in a number of ways. They can provide incentives to China and also Brazil and other developing countries that are active in Africa to ensure that they transfer technology to the continent. Now, this is very important because no nation, you cannot have a viable manufacturing industry or lay the condition for sound and sustained economic growth without technological progress. Technology, innovation, they are the key to manufacturing success. So if you want to benefit from this, you have to ensure that China invests in these types of technological progress-related activities. So you can give them incentives, as I said earlier. If China wants to invest in an African country, the country could say, well, we'll let you invest, and we'll give you, for example, some tax breaks if you train a given number of Africans. In terms of, understanding the technological component of whatever manufacturing activity they're going to be engaged in. So that will ensure that even when the Chinese leave, the local capacity to produce some of these goods remain in Africa. And that is essential in terms of, manufacturing success. Now, they can also promote infrastructure development. They can improve access to credit. Credit is a very important aspect of developing productive capacity. In fact, one of the reasons we don't have a viable manufacturing industry in Africa is that entrepreneurs do not have access to credit. It's very difficult to get formal credit. You cannot walk into a bank and say, I have a great idea. Can I get a loan to develop, say, an engine project or aircraft project, whatever it is. You cannot do that. You can do that in Europe, you can do that in Asia, but not in Africa. Nobody will give you a loan. But you can get a loan to be a candidate for an election if you have some connections. You'll be amazed at how much you can get to finance an election campaign. But you cannot get one to finance an industrial activity. It's more difficult. So that mindset has to change if African countries want to move ahead. And finally, they have to encourage foreign firms to source inputs locally. I think I've mentioned this earlier. For example, China, when China invests in any manufacturing activity in Africa, it brings Chinese labor. But the local government, could impose a condition that they have to use a substantial part of local labor so that you can create linkages between that investment and the local economy in terms of employment. Okay. Now, another thing that African governments can do is to be more assertive. I think I started with this. They have to be more proactive. China should not lead the process. One thing people forget is that Africa is not a country. Sometimes when people talk about Africa, you get the impression that it's a country. It is not a country. It is a continent of 53 countries. I mean, we don't talk about Asia, Europe. We'll talk about France, Germany, UK. But for some reason, in Africa, people always talk Africa. Nobody calls the countries. It's Africa. Who is Africa? Africa is not a country. It's a continent, for God's sake. It has about 15% of the world's population. I mean, we talk a lot about China. China is 1.3 billion people. Africa is 1 billion. So it's almost the size of China in terms of population. Now, in terms of GDP, maybe it hasn't gone that far. But It is a continent, and people have to recognize this when they're talking about China, Africa. And now, if you consider that fact, then it's not China that should be leading the process. China has a lot of strategic interests in Africa. It needs African countries. China, the fact is this, China cannot sustain its economic growth without Africa. It needs huge amount of resources from Africa, which means African countries have to exploit this advantage that they have with China. They cannot let the Chinese just lead the process. Nobody's saying they should compete or fight with the Chinese, but at least they should protect their own national interest. It shouldn't be doing whatever China says. You know? So they have to be assertive in the process. They should be proactive, not reactive. And that's the only way they can get more out of the process. And then the next point is that African countries tend to negotiate with China, and it's usually a government-to-government process. Now, of course, the Chinese, they have their own local accountability mechanisms, but in Africa, the executive branch negotiates these deals without even talking to parliament. They don't talk to parliament, they don't talk to civil society, they don't talk to any local stakeholder. You wake up one morning and you read in the papers, oh, Kenya or Gambia signed an agreement of 9 billion with China. Parliament is not even aware of this. Now, but if you incur debt as a result of this, it is a country that pays for it through taxes and things like that. So it's very important that when governments get into these relationships, they take along the local stakeholders. That would ensure that there's some sort of accountability. So you know exactly how much they're getting from China, under what conditions, who should be held responsible when things go wrong, and so on and so forth. That's how things all function in developed countries. I cannot imagine the German chancellor getting into some big commitment externally without talking to parliament. I mean, that would be like a scandal here, no? But for some reason in Africa, it's accepted. So that shouldn't be the case. Okay, so, I mean, there are other points, but I think I've made the key point for Africa. Now, what can China do? The first is that it has to pay more attention to regional issues. I mean, now they tend to focus more on national issues. I mean, China may go to Gambia and to do one thing, to go to Cote d'Ivoire to do another thing. But China has not paid attention to the regional dimension of its relationship with Africa. It's clear that regional integration is a key factor in terms of integrating Africa into the global economy. So China needs to do something to sort of fast-track Africa's regional integration efforts. And one way it could do that is to pay more attention to the development of regional infrastructure. Because if you have cross-border infrastructure, that will help to boost intra-African trade, boost intra-African investment, increase regional growth, and then make Africa even a more effective source of demand for Chinese products. So it's a win-win competition. It's not just for Africa. If China can help Africa to fast-track its regional integration process, China will benefit from it, because as Africa grows from that, they will demand more from China in terms of imports. And that will help China grow too. So it's a win-win cooperation. And then the second thing China could do is to use its aid policies to promote skill and technology transfer. I've already mentioned the importance of this, so I'm going to leave it there. Thirdly, it should promote linkages between its investment and domestic African economies. It should incorporate capacity building into its investment activities. It shouldn't focus solely on new projects. It should also talk about maintenance. And finally, it should provide more information, because information is key to assessing impact. And China so far hasn't done that. Okay, in conclusion, I'm just going to make 3 key points. One is that Africa's growing relationship with China has had a positive impact, and we should strengthen it. The second is that China and Africa should manage this relationship in a way that results in win-win cooperation. And that requires that China should strike a balance between its interests in Africa and Africa's development needs. And it requires that African countries should have a coherent strategy which reflects national as well as regional interests. Now, they may be difficult, but they're certainly not something that is not doable. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a riveting lecture. And now we can take some questions.
Good evening and thank you. I'm just wondering about, I think it was the second last slide, or maybe the last slide, the one about China and what China should do.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that China has a strategy and Africa more or less just has, the African states have wish lists, right? And yet you are advocating that China does that. Why should they do that when they already have a strategy and it seems to be working for them? Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I'm just thinking, what's the incentive for them changing to something which looks very benevolent here? Yeah, and then on the last part, what do you suppose, the bottom power bullet point there, what do you suppose is the reason for the lack of transparency regarding the aid flows or the interaction with China? What's the reason behind all the secrecy?
Okay. Well, okay, let me start with the last one. I cannot tell you that I know the real reason for that, but I can speculate. And with that is to say that I think they are afraid that if, you see, like I said, remember I said that Africa is not a country, it's a region. Sorry, it's not a country, it is a region, yes. Now, we have 53 countries dealing with China. Let's say China indicates that it gave $9 million as aid to Côte d'Ivoire. And it gave 30 million to Ethiopia. You think the Ivoirians will be happy? They're going to call China the next day and say, oh, your aid to us is just 4 million, and you gave Ethiopia 30 million? But we think our relationship with you is more stronger than Ethiopia. So I think this is what they're afraid of, in a sense. This is my interpretation of what's going on. So I think they are worried about, and also they're worried about the political economy in China also. Don't forget that China has a lot of poor people. So they don't want their people reading in the press that they're giving these huge sums of money here and there while Chinese are suffering. Now, of course, the Chinese government is doing it because they think it's in their long-term interest. But the poor people there, they don't look at it in these terms. So I think in a sense, they're also worried about the potential for domestic conflicts within China. Yeah. Now, regarding your first question, I think they're not necessarily inconsistent. I think it's in China's interest. For now, they're enjoying it, but it is not sustainable. And I think that's the key point. It is not sustainable. If they continue the way they're going, at some point, there will be a revolt in Africa again. We're already seeing it in Zambia. Go to the copper belts and see what's happening. They're already revolting against Chinese workers coming in. So if you don't deal with it now, they will have to deal with it in about 5, 10 years. So it is certainly in their interest to change this pattern of relationship. Of course, governments like easy things. For now, it's easy, so they're enjoying it. But, I think as more African countries demand that they do more, they will do more because it is in their interest.
Thank you for your presentation. I have first make a comment for this. There are also some disagreements between the Chinese population about the aid, let me call it aid, or the money given to African countries, and especially between the poorer people in China. They are actually not happy about this, and there are voices who are asking why the money is given and why this aid is not, or this money is not used for developing their own country and their own people. Yep. Then I have a question. What do you think about the political motivation of China giving this aid. I think there might be some motivations for the one China politic against against Taiwan. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's, well, you see, China's relationship, China has always been interested in Africa. I mean, let's not kid ourselves into thinking that it started 10 years ago, no. Right from 1949, China has always been interested in Africa. Now, what is interesting is that in the past, up until 1978, well, up until 1978, China had a lot of interest in Africa, but that was driven by the politics of ideology. Then between 78 and, let's say, the end of the 80s, China's interest in Africa was reduced a little bit, partly because they were more concerned about domestic economic problems in China. So Africa was not, like a major issue. They were still interested in Africa, but Africa was not a major issue for China. And then, beginning in 1990, and more importantly, at the beginning of the current century, China developed a new type of relationship with Africa. And it's no longer based on the politics of ideology. It's based on economic interests. So their motivation now is more economic than political. Yes, I am. This is one thing. I'm not sure about a lot of things, but this is one thing I'm sure of. At least that's what the data shows us. And when you talk to, actually, I was in China. I was in China in June to give a seminar at the World Expo in Shanghai. And this was one of the big issues there. What is China's interest in Africa? And when you talk to the Chinese, they will tell you, they're not hiding it. The only thing that they don't like is people saying that they're in Africa just for resources. But they will tell you they have economic interest in Africa. But they want to do it in a way that would also help Africa. So it's certainly an economic story. Yeah. So I don't know, did I answer your question or? Partly. Partly. Okay, so which one didn't I answer? Please let me know.
There are a lot of African countries which get support from China, which supporting the politics, which are supporting afterwards the Chinese politics.
Oh, okay.
To,
yeah, I agree with you. I'm not disputing that. If you look at most of the commitments that China has made to Africa, sometimes they put a clause. We're going to give debt relief to African countries except those for which that do not have diplomatic relations with China. By that they mean those that have diplomatic relations with Taiwan. There are about 4 countries. I think Burkina Faso, the Gambia, I don't know, Lesotho, Swaziland, one of those. But there are 4 countries in Africa that's small countries. Yeah. So yeah, certainly that's a big issue for China.
Hi, firstly, I'd like to thank you for your presentation. I'm going to use my country as an example because obviously I don't know enough about other countries and their situations. I come from Zimbabwe. And I can think of 2 reasons why my country will not be one of the first ones to tell China to change their policies. Firstly, because out of these 53 countries, Zimbabwe can look at this and say, if we're the first ones to say no, China's just going to go somewhere else. And they want to hold on to this relationship because we have such a poor relationship with the West, and we want to prove to the America and to Europe that we can still have good relations with somewhere else. Secondly, because China doesn't influence the sovereignty of African countries, because China doesn't have anything to say about the political situation. If you take a look at during the March 2008 elections in Zimbabwe, there was violence leading up to the elections, and the international human rights community stopped a ship that came from China full of weapons. And China obviously cared about the the trade, and didn't look into the effects that it could have on the people. And that's those are 2 of the reasons why I think a lot of countries are not going to ask China to leave. And I'd like to know what you think about that.
Okay. I mean, that's a fair point. But if you recall what I said earlier, I said that African countries should try to reconcile their national interests with the regional objective. You see, I think African countries they will be kidding themselves into thinking that by trying to that they can protect, they will be kidding themselves into thinking that by protecting their national interests, they will be better off in the long run. If you think only about your national interests, in a static way, it's not going to be better for you in the long run. I mean, they have to recognize that there is power in acting together. If you look at each African country relative to China, they are small. The power that African countries have over China is as a group. So if Zimbabwe says that China is doing something that it doesn't like, but it doesn't want to say no to China because it feels China will run away to another African country. Well, that's possible if all African countries think that way. But if African countries recognize that they have power collectively, and they use that power in dealing with China, China will change. One thing that people don't understand about China is that the Chinese are very sensitive to criticism. If African countries as a group say they don't want China to do A, B, C, D, China will pay attention. But if it's one country speaking, no, it won't. So I think it's important that we don't just look at this as a national issue. We should also look at it from a regional perspective, because that's the only way African countries can have some bargaining power over China. That's just my personal view. But you're right. I mean, countries can decide to keep quiet for the reasons that you just adduced.
Yeah. I just want to quickly reinforce what you just said about the reason for cooperation for all African countries coming together. Because I think the relationship Africa has with other regions of the world, I mean, China as with other, I was kind of surprised a while ago that I'm an Apple freak person. And from every Apple product I buy, I would say designed in California, made in China. And these are quality products from China. And it's been sold in US, it's been sold in Europe. Mm-hmm. Meaning that the relationship with China and Europe, or perhaps in United States, they have economic relationship. And they can go there and make, because of cheap labor and other reasons, make the products. And these products are of better quality than the one they will export to Africa. Meaning that if African states can come together to set the terms for this relationship, the Chinese will change, and there's possibility for improvement in what we get from this relationship, whether economic, political, or whatever reasons.
So I agree with you. So I'm not going to add more to it. I agree with what you said.
Thank you for your presentation. I just want to find out from you, why is Africa not, maybe I'm part of those that call the all of Africa, the countries, but why do you think we're not a manufacturing continent? Do you think it's because we lack the expertise, resources, or is it just plain down to lack of foresight by the leaders?
It's a very, very pertinent question. Well, there are various reasons why we don't. Again, it depends on from country to country, but there's a general theme that we see across African countries that have not been able to develop a strong manufacturing base. One is, economic policies in Africa tend to be anti-manufacturing in a sense. Manufacturing is becoming so competitive in the global economy that, if governments do not make a conscious effort to enact economic policies that will help the manufacturing sector to be competitive globally, then that country will never develop a competitive manufacturing industry. I talked about the fact that Chinese consumer products are displacing such products in Africa, partly because the Chinese are able to produce them at a very low cost, which is strange because these are labor-intensive products. Textiles, these are labor-intensive products. And you would think that Africa should be more competitive in textile production. But because of difficulty of obtaining finance, African manufacturing manufacturers have difficulty getting loans at reasonable interest rates from banks. In China, the government subsidizes these loans. So if you're a manufacturer and you produce it in China, your unit cost is lower. Because when you add up all these production costs, you find that your costs per unit of output are much lower than in Africa. Now, another reason we have difficulties is that it has to do with infrastructure. I think this morning the ambassador from Morocco was talking about the development of renewable energy. In fact, one of the major constraints in the development of a strong manufacturing base in Africa is poor infrastructure. How can you manufacture products when you don't have stable electricity supply? It's not possible. It's just not possible. Let's take Nigeria, for example. In Nigeria, if you open any manufacturing firm, you have to buy like a huge generating plant. This is a huge cost to production. Firms in China don't face that. Firms in Asia don't face that. It's a unique African problem. I mean, other regions have problems of infrastructure, but not to the extent we have in Africa. I mean, the constraints are so binding that you cannot develop a competitive manufacturing sector in a world where you have open borders. It's just not possible. I mean, there are other reasons, if you take a country like Angola, Sudan, Nigeria, these are oil producers, so they don't see any big deal in putting their energy into manufacturing when they can just explore for oil and make billions of dollars in foreign exchange. So I think there's an incentive issue there, though. Yeah. I think there's somewhere there.
Thank you. I've really gained a lot from your presentation. But I just wanted to shed more light in China's participation or partnership with Africa from the perspective of encouraging crisis. China is a friend to virtually all the despots we have in Africa. Every country where there is crisis, China has a prominent presence there. In Congo, in Zimbabwe, in Sudan, they are the major economic partners to these countries, or the leaders, in quotes. How do we now say that China is partnering with Africa economically, giving aids, investing in other places, and even the crisis-torn areas, and at the same time, what we need as internal cohesion in Africa, what they are giving, the parts China is playing in all these crisis zones, is not helping matters. So what kind of partnership is that? You are stabbing me and you are helping me blow some air of relief at the same time. How do we reconcile that?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, I don't like mentioning names of countries on issues like this, but I mean, let's just take the case of Zimbabwe. Let's take the case of Zimbabwe. Now, are we going to say that because China gave aid to Zimbabwe, therefore China is responsible for the crisis in Zimbabwe? Of course not. The crisis there, it's a local problem. It's a political problem, Now, the Chinese, as I said earlier, they have a policy of non-interference. So what they will tell you is that they don't interfere in the internal affairs of any country. And for a good reason, because China has its own human rights problems. So it doesn't want to be seen as, it's like if you live in a glass house, don't throw stones. So for me, the issue is not so much whether China, I mean, what can China do to Zimbabwe? If China doesn't give aid to Zimbabwe, it's not going to make Zimbabwe the Zimbabwean government to suddenly wish away all the problems it has. No, the crisis is not going to end because China stopped giving aid. If you look at the aid they give to Zimbabwe, it's almost an insignificant part of Zimbabwean's GDP. So, yeah. Okay, right. Yeah.
When there is a sanction coming or hacks of sanction coming on these African countries and leaders,
Right.
China will veto the thing.
Yeah.
And yes, and this goes a long way to determine the impact, the result or outcome that United Nations wants to get by reason of that sanction.
Yeah, that's certainly not helpful. Yeah, that's. I mean, you're right. There's no in that area. They've certainly not helped matters. There's no doubt about it. Yeah, that's true.
Hi, I'll take 2 questions, if that's okay.
Okay. So.
Hello, I'm Thomas from Berlin, cultural and communication scientist. Thank you again for your presentation. And I'd like to know in how far the human rights issue plays a role in the contacts between Africa and China. And if not so, for instance, in the case of the Nobel Peace Prize now, and if not so, is this one of the minor issues that China is so much interested in Africa because it's not offended somehow in terms of the unanswered questions towards human rights and all these issues?
Okay, thank you. You see, most African governments are very uncomfortable discussing human rights issues. So, I mean, they're actually happy that China doesn't get involved in these issues. So, partly because, they have all sorts of problems, and they certainly don't want China to raise this issue. China. Oh, they certainly don't want to do that because if they start getting involved in Chinese politics or human rights issues, certainly China will feel the need to also get involved in theirs. And so it's, I mean, that's right. That's right. I mean, one of the reasons they value these relationships is that they're based on non-interference, and that is what is common in all the relationship that Africa has with non-African developing countries. Korea does not get involved in human rights issues in Africa. Turkey doesn't. India doesn't. Brazil doesn't. China doesn't. So it's not just China. It's a developing country issue. Developing country leaders don't want to see somebody from another developing country telling them what they should do, within their country. So, I mean, I think if China starts it, it's going to create a lot of political problems. I can imagine.
Is this one of the reasons why this partnership is functioning economically so well?
Partly because I mean, a lot of countries are moving away slowly from trading with OECD countries to trading with China because they don't come with strings. So that's why they find it very appealing. I mean, if you look at China's contribution to Africa, even in terms of aid, it's almost insignificant compared to what OECD countries give. So OECD countries give more money to Africa than China. Yet, African countries are more excited talking about China-Africa relationship. It is incredible. And it's because the Chinese don't interfere in their domestic matters. I believe, anyway.
I have a few observations. I don't think it's prudent to reduce one's analysis of history to the period after 1949 or 47. I think you said 1949. I'm not implying that you did that. Maybe there's some people in the audience who don't study history or are not aware of certain historical facts. But to understand this problem, we got to understand slavery. We got to understand colonialism. They're all interconnected. I just asked Regina how many people are in Lesotho. She didn't know, so we went to the internet and we looked. There are 1.8 million people living in Lesotho.
Sorry, living where?
In Lesotho.
Okay, okay.
The brother here talked about corruption, you know, and also talked about human rights and whatever. But not one time, and I've been to many of these gatherings, presentations. On many occasions, I've mentioned that there are 1.5 million black men in prison in America. Now think about that for a minute. We have almost a total population of Lesotho in the prisons of America and exclusively black, that particular number. Just to be precise, there are about 2.4 million people in prison in America, 200,000 whites, 600,000 Latinos, and 1.5 million blacks. I say that human rights question is directly related to that condition, directly related to it. And so we should be very careful about looking at things in isolation. As far as China is concerned, we have to look at China in terms of before colonialism, during it, and after it. I mean, China was a victim of colonialism just like the countries of Africa and the New World. If we go back to the Opium Wars, the Europeans were putting all the Chinese on dope, making money. I don't know if they've recovered from that. You have to think about that for a minute. So this whole question of China and who's ever given aid has to be looked at in its historical context. Nothing else will serve it any justice. Nothing else. So if we just, as I said before, if we just perceive it just from our own lifespan, well, we're not going to get a very good analysis. It's just not going to happen. And people should study history as much as they can, the histories of their countries, and also the history of the world. One thing is self-evident. We're all human beings, and we all live on this damn planet. You know, and I don't ascribe, quite frankly, I live in one of the most racist, oppressive, or did, because I know, still Germany belongs to the gang, but America, no one's criticized America. They're too busy criticizing Zimbabwe. I'm saying, what's going on? Torture, global warming. The United States puts more pollutants in the air and particulates than any other country. 50% of the pollution is a result of American consumption. Let's deal with that. Let's deal with the impact of that. And I mean, the list goes on. I could talk for about 3 or 4 hours about those contradictions. But when we're tackling these issues, we have to be precise because we're among academics here, I would assume, and so the arguments have to be sound and they have to be based in reality, and in some study. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think it's a comment. You've all heard what he said, so it's emphasizing the need to take a historical approach. So, I mean, I don't think anyone would disagree with taking a historical approach.
Okay, thanks for your rich presentation. Okay, to be brief, okay, everybody speaks about the investment of China in Africa. Okay, I want to know, what about the investment of Africa in China, if there is any? Are they profitable? Second question, okay, so as you know, okay, nowadays, okay, China is invading the African market. What are the reactions of Europe and the United States of America, okay? And what are the consequences on local African market? Thank you very much.
Okay, let me start with the second part of the question. I think I already addressed that. I said that, Chinese manufactured goods are displacing African manufacturing producers. It's a big issue in Ghana, in parts of Southern Africa, mostly in connection with textiles. I think it's an issue that each African country will have to try to address with China to ensure that it doesn't result in deindustrialization, because this is a very serious thing for African countries. Regarding your first question, whether African countries invest in China, yes, they do. They do invest in China, but it's almost negligible. It's almost insignificant in relation to total investment in China. And actually, last June, when I gave a talk in Shanghai, one of the African ambassadors he was upset with the Chinese. He said, "Why is it that in Africa, when the Chinese come to Africa, we welcome them, we allow them invest, we allow them to trade, we allow them to come with their people, they can work on roads and so on and so forth. But it's so difficult for Africans to go to China to invest. And when they try to, they face all sorts of barriers." So, and this was it was a big issue during the presentation. And fortunately, we had some officials from the Ministry of Commerce in China. So, and I mean, they did try to explain that they would convey the concerns of the African community there to the government, to ensure that their concerns are taken seriously. But one problem I see with China's or Africa's inability to penetrate Chinese markets is a language issue also. I think that you see, it's easy for Africans to trade with Europeans, partly because of our past. A lot of Africans speak English, French, so it's easy to trade and do things, with Europeans. We've had a long history of interaction with them. Now, in the case of China, it's very few Chinese people speak any African language. So when they come to Africa, and in fact, it's one of the reasons. In fact, this was what I said in China. I told the Chinese in Shanghai that they also have to make an effort to learn local African languages. If they feel that Africa is suddenly very important to them, they have to invest in African languages. Because if you can't communicate very well with the person you're trading with, it's obviously a barrier. Now, in the case of Africa, I mean, if African countries feel that they would like to invest more in China, they have to make an effort to learn Mandarin. You have to be able to talk to them. Otherwise, you'll be going through a third party, and it's never easy for a businessman or an entrepreneur who wants to go. Sometimes you want to talk to somebody directly, not through a third party. So these are some of the barriers. But I think a large part of it has to do with government policies in China.
Hi, sorry, I had a question actually. My question is about the relation between how China and Africa do business and how Europe and Africa do business. One of the main points that come often, and I was having this discussion before, is China's way of doing business with African countries is seen as a new way, where African countries are seen more as business partners than, as you mentioned, aid recipients. But looking at your presentation, I was really interested. I noticed that in the end, you have Chinese goods coming to Africa and being a competition for African goods, and other elements that make China the winner in this relationship, let's say. And in that sense, it seems to me as if in the end, it's the same result as Europe being the winner as well with China. Like you mentioned, they build the road, they build the train tracks, but 10 years later, it doesn't work. Like they give the fish, but they don't teach how to fish, in a sense. So what would be your recommendation to find a middle ground between, say, the European way of doing business with Africa and the Chinese way?
Okay, thank you. It's a bit, sometimes when you make a presentation, people always remember the negative thing you said. It's incredible. Because if you recall, when I started talking about the impact of China-Africa cooperation, I listed 5 positive points and 1 negative. And so unfortunately, the negative part is what has taken over the whole discussion, which was what I was trying to avoid. But you see, I think on average, like in every relationship, I said, we always have challenges in relationships. The issue is to find a way to ensure that, on average, it's positive. The impact is positive. In the case of China, Africa, I think there are lots of positive elements to what's going on. Now, of course, China can do better to improve the relationship and ensure that Africa derives more from the process. And I've listed a number of things they could do. Sorry, what was the second question? I just forgot the second question. Could you remind me?
About what you think should be done to find a middle ground between the two ways of doing things.
Okay. Yeah, now I've recalled what you said. Let me put it this way. You see, OECD countries have been giving assistance to Africa for decades. So in terms of the scale, they've made significant contributions to Africa's development. In terms of the scale of their activities. China has just started, in terms of, if you look at the scale of China's activities relative to those of OECD countries. Yet, if you go to an African country and ask the leaders, do you prefer China or OECD? The answer will be, they will give you is China. Why is that? It's the approach. That's why I'm saying that the approach is important. Because the Chinese treat them as equals. They treat them as business partners. They don't treat them as people they give them aid. So it's very important in having a long-term relationship with somebody to be sensitive to how the person sees that relationship. And I think that's what the OECD countries are missing. And I think that's what they should learn from these relationships with, between developing countries. They have to understand that developing countries are very sensitive, partly because of their colonial past, history, or legacy. They can't wish it away. They are very sensitive to being told what to do. So as long as OECD countries understand that, they will start having a more enduring relationship with Africa. So I think it matters, even if the outcome in terms of economic indicators is the same between China-Africa relationship and Europe-Africa relationship. The approach is different. And that is very important to African countries. It's not to me, but to African leaders. When you ask them, this is what they say. So I think it's important. I think, it's like when you want to say something to somebody, you have to think about how best to say it so that the person receives it in a positive way. It's important not only in business, it's also in personal relationships. So they need to understand that.
Thank you. I just want to buttress what you just said. I'm involved in the National Identity Project in Nigeria. And SAGEM, France, was commissioned to do the IT architecture and the details for the project. When they finished with the registration and everything, SAGEM took the code, the password, to enter into the server away, back to France. And the backup for the entire national database is in France. What am I bringing out? When the project is about starting again now, they approached SAGEM that the password to this server, or give us a copy of the backup you have there or something. They said no, that it's not part of the agreement signed that they will release the password and the database, the backup to Nigeria, a national database for a country. You said it's not in the agreement to give them the password to enter into their own database. Whereas an Asian company said, we will do everything for you. The backup, the password, everything will be in your hand. So in such situation, now what SAGEM did, billions of dollars invested in that thing, is more or less useless now because we can't access it. That is at the national level. So it's unfortunate. And if such experience, goes and cuts across different areas of national and regional lives, then definitely Africa will prefer to go with China.
I do have another question. In how far does the relation in terms of economy?
In terms of what?
In terms of economy. I mean, the economic relations go along with the cultural interest between both continents. I mean, both, Africa and China. Because you've been mentioning now the lack of interest in terms of learning languages from the Chinese and learning African language, and how far the interest is there to learn from the cultures, both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I think I did talk a lot about the economic relationships, but there are also cultural relationships that have been developed, in parallel with the economic relationships. In fact, China has invited a lot of Africans to China to sort of, they call it people-to-people exchange, to bring them to get to know China's way of life, the Chinese way of doing things, and so on and so forth. The idea is, to bring them closer to the Chinese so that, they can form some sort of bond, that can enhance their political and economic cooperation. So the cultural relationship goes hand in hand with economic and political relationships. It's just that people don't talk a lot about the cultural aspect. I don't know, maybe it's boring, but for some reason the economic aspect seems to be the thing that captures people's interest.
I'd like to thank you very much for your lecture, and I'd like to thank the participants for all your contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.